Should you have Uber driver and Lyft driver on your resume in 2025? Now, in case you didn't know, take a side note. I used to be a former accountant. I did some resume reviews. I also hired and interviewed people on behalf of Microsoft. So I reviewed literally hundreds upon hundreds of resumes. So this is something I know a lot about. And of course, I used to be an Uber driver and Lyft driver. So I'm going to give you a short answer and then a long answer because I hate YouTubers that ramble on. Short answers, I'm going to say this. In most cases, in about 90% of cases, maybe, I'm going to say yes. And in 10% of cases, I'm going to say no. So now let's get into the nitty gritty as why you should or shouldn't. And I'm going to make this as very straightforward as possible, as like I said, I know a lot about resumes. First off, your resume should revolve around quality, not quantity, right? So for example, if let's say you have a bunch of jobs all over the place, and let's say your resume is 3 pages long, that is way too long. Typically, when it comes to a recruiter or somebody scanning your resume, they literally scan it, right? They scan it. And what I suggest is make sure your resume, if you can, is 1 page. That's optimal. Now, if your resume is over 1 page, let's say it's 2 pages, you better be dang confident that there's a really good reason why it's longer than a page. Like, let's say you do have a tremendous amount of work experience, a lot of skills that you want to highlight, and a lot of stuff that isn't just fluff and just filler. You should absolutely have it be more than a page if it is worth it. Remember, quality over quantity. There are certain jobs for me that I've not put on my resume because I have so many good high quality jobs. Like for me personally, I actually don't have being an Uber driver or Lyft driver on my resume. Then again, I've been a full-time YouTuber and musician for the past 10 years, so I haven't had to apply to like a real job, so to speak, in the past 10 years. But even still, I don't think I put it on my resume because quality over quantity. Like I said though, unless you have a bunch of very specific jobs, I'd say for most people, it doesn't hurt. And that's one thing I do want to say is that in general, maybe I would put it on my resume if like say I was hiring again, just to have something. So the first thing is quality over quantity. If you already have a bajillion jobs on your resume, they're good quality jobs that highlight some skill sets that you have as a person, as an individual, as an employee, it might not be as necessary, but like say you don't, definitely put it on your resume. Second thing is any type of gaps. That's the next thing I'm going to go to. So for example, let's say there's a period of time in your resume, this is something a lot of employers like to see, where you have a consistent thing where you worked at this one company for 4 years, then another company and stuff like that. But let's say you have a random year or 2 year gap on your resume, and there was nothing going on during that period of time. Some employers might ask you like, hey, we noticed this 2 or 3 year gap on your resume or a year gap on your resume. What happened there? And I do suggest if you do have a pretty decent gap, say a year on your resume, I do suggest not a bad idea, put an Uber driver and Lyft driver. And you can say, hey, you know what? I decided to drive for Uber and Lyft. In the meantime, I was working on this one project. I wanted to take time off and just kind of focus on myself. I was looking for other jobs. I was whatever you want to say, right? And that can be a good way to bridge one job to another. Because the big thing when it comes to Uber and Lyft, in general, we probably all know this, when it comes to Uber and Lyft, 99.9% of people interviewing you are going to know what Uber and Lyft is, right? And so they're going to at least be in the know about that particular job. And so when they scan your resume, they'll instantly know, Uber driver, Lyft driver, that makes sense. And then they can kind of bridge the gap. You're like, okay, you took time off for a year. You want to find the right job. You want to figure out what is your passion, what you really want to get into. And then that can transition you into the next job or continuing on, right? So any type of gap in your resume, let's say right now you're interviewing, and let's say you have a bunch of work experience, maybe put right now, Uber driver, Lyft driver, whenever you started to present. That way you're saying, hey, right now I'm driving for Uber and Lyft to bridge my past job to now to make money. I really want to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, and I realize this is my passion, whatever job you're interviewing for, et cetera, right? So that's the second thing. Any gap in your resume, I do suggest, let's say, especially if it's a year or longer, and you were driving for Uber and Lyft, do that. Thirdly, and this is a big one a lot of people forget, and like I said, some of this video will teeter on, of course, Uber and Lyft, but also just resume advice in general. This is a big thing, like I said. I used to hire and train people on behalf of Microsoft, is this. When it comes to your resume, a lot of people forget that if you get that interview, you are typically 9 times out of 10 qualified for that job. I might even say 10 out of 10 times. If somebody gets your resume and they give you that interview, I might say almost 10 out of 10 times you are qualified. They wouldn't give you the interview if you weren't qualified for the position. They want to see, could I put a good face to the name? Are they respectable? Are they the kind of person I want to see working at my company? Are they the kind of person that, if someone meets them, says they work for my company, that I can trust them, they'll give a good impression of an employee of my company, if that makes sense, right? In general, they want to make sure, can I hire this person, this guy or this girl, right? And a big thing a lot of interviewers do, this is something that I did, is they just want to have a conversation with you. They're not going to quiz you or test you. Some interviews they do, but it's very rare. But in most cases, they just want to get to know you. And one of the biggest ways is by having information on your resume. This is why I suggest, as a quick side note, to have a lot of interests. Like, for example, do you play piano? Are you really big into sports? One of my girlfriends, for example, got a job at the Boston Red Sox doing marketing for them because she put an interest of hers was Call of Duty. The entire interview, all they did was talk about Call of Duty, right? And so putting interests on your resume, as long as it's not something that's crass or inappropriate, is a good way because most of the time in an interview, they might talk about that. Like, hey, I noticed you put breakdancing on your resume. Tell me about that. When I got a job at one of the big four public accounting firms, for example, all my interviews were talking about parkour. I'm not exaggerating because on paper, like I said, they already know you're qualified based on my GPA, my experience, etc. They just want to know, can I talk to this person? Can I have a conversation with them? Can I trust them? Are they a good person to hire? Are they, all these kind of qualities that you want in a good employee. And one thing I will say about Uber and Lyft, bringing now that back to this particular specific video, one thing I will say about Uber and Lyft is all of us, all the drivers have probably experienced this. When you say, oh yeah, I drive for Uber and Lyft, or I used to drive for Uber and Lyft, everybody usually says the same thing. Oh, I bet you have a lot of stories. And so that's one thing that can kind of be a good conversation point, in my opinion, is that a lot of people, especially if you drove on a lot of Friday and Saturday nights, a lot of drivers have a lot of experience with people, dealing with conversations, dealing with conflictions as well, dealing with tricky situations and how to navigate them, both literally on the road, but also figuratively when it comes to, like, say, something that's going on in your car. You never know. And I think this could be another good conversation point. Like I said, not only put your interests on your resume, what you should do in general, but you never know. If you put Uber and Lyft on your resume, whether it's to add more stuff onto your resume, again, quality over quantity, remember that, whether it's a gap, however you want to do it, I guarantee the interviewer might say, and in the entire interview, you might say, hey, I noticed Uber and Lyft. Tell me about that. And I guarantee all of us have stories. And you're like, oh yeah, it was a very interesting time. You could talk about different points. I also think, in my opinion too, there are a lot of, I'm going to say benefits, if I had to word it like that, and skill sets that you need to have as being a driver. Because a lot of people think, oh yeah, driving, of course. But all of us drive. Most people drive, right? When it comes to being an Uber and Lyft driver, though, there are a lot of things you have to deal with in terms of, customer service, interacting with different cultures, nationalities, races, sexual orientations, all of these different walks of life. And like I said, too, dealing with sometimes conflicting issues, dealing with difficult people or passengers and how to negotiate that and mitigate situations. There's a lot to being a driver, as we all know. A lot of it is psychology and human interaction. And so there can be, I think, good talking points and good things to talk about when it comes to being a driver. So overall, like I said, those 3 points are the big ones I'm going to say. One, quality over quantity. What do I say for 90% of people? I might say to put it on your resume. Unless you have a crazy list of stuff on your resume, like you have Google and then Apple and then Microsoft or whatever. Unless you have some crazy things, I don't think it's as necessary. But I think for a lot of people, you might as well put it on your resume, right? Quality over quantity, but never a bad idea, especially if it highlights different skill sets than your other jobs. So if, like, say, I only have, to use that example again, tech experience, might not be a bad idea to have Uber and Lyft saying, hey, not only do I have tech experience being a computer programmer, but I also have customer service experience. I also have customer service experience dealing with people in terms of the psychology and all that kind of stuff, not just programming, in terms of, very logical stuff, but also emotional, having a high EQ, Second thing, of course, any type of gap in your resume. Having something just to bridge the gap can do really, really well. And then thirdly, it can be a great conversation starter. It can be a good thing to talk about during the interview, because a lot of times, like I said, they're not really going to quiz you on stuff you learned in school. They're not really going to ask you about technical things here and there. They might ask you on prior jobs, like, hey, I noticed you have experience in this or this or this. Tell me more about that. A lot of times, they're just looking to have a conversation. That's kind of it. And this is why having things like interests, like I said, on your resume can be great. But also, having Uber and Lyft driver on there And I guarantee we all have a bunch of stories, like I've said a couple times already throughout this video. And what you can do is talk about that. Talk about your stories, your experiences as an Uber and Lyft driver, which can help you get, hopefully, that job that you're looking for.